Hi, I'm Brian Schrader, and you're listening to Outstanding in Your Field, powered by Pioneer Agronomy. I'm here with my co-hosts, agronomist Carl Joran and Crystal Williams.
Think of us as IT for your crops. If we know how to fix your issues, we'll tell you. And if not, we've probably got a workaround.
And if we don't, we'll find one, because Mother Nature isn't like an on-off switch.
Well, on today's episode, we have our guest is Scott Eversgerd, local to Illinois. We figured who better to talk about wheat with our listeners than the one and only wheat expert, Scott Eversgerd. So, Scott, would you take a moment and introduce yourself to our listeners and a little bit about your background, what you like to do when you're not working, and also your history with Pioneer?
Thanks for the invite, Crystal. And so Scott Eversgerd, field agronomist for Pioneer. Been with Pioneer now going on 23 years, all of it right here in good old Southern Illinois. So I live in Nashville, which is about 50 miles straight east of St. Louis. So as it comes to wheat, as you look at the state of Illinois and where the soft red winter wheat acres are, it's really that I-64 corridor east out of St. Louis is where a lot of the acres are. So if you take an average acres in Illinois in any given year, around 700,000 to 800,000 acres of wheat in Illinois, you'll get close to half of that right in about 5 or 6 counties right there along I-64. So a good chunk of the wheat in Illinois really resides right here in the southern belt of Illinois. So, I cut my teeth on wheat starting a little over 30 years ago in Kentucky. Working with some of those guys down there on the high management wheat as I got out of school and started my first job and started my career there. So, here 23 years later, still with Pioneer, still in the same spot. So glad to be here this morning.
You're kind of in the backyard capital for another unique fun fact about Illinois is you're pretty darn close to the ski capital of Illinois, aren't you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So in Clinton County, that's where one of the bottling plants for the original ski. So you can still go there and buy it in the 12-ounce glass bottles with still made with pure cane sugar. And that's the good stuff. You want the high octane ski, you go to Breeze and get it in the glass bottles.
I know what I'm asking for the next time we have a meeting together, Scott. I didn't know that, and I absolutely love ski. You can't find it up here. I'm excited to know that now.
It is very delicious. I do remember when I was first starting off as an agronomist, I did a ride along with Scott, and that was one of our stops in the morning, was to stop at whatever gas station it was that had the highest octane, fountain ski, and it was really good. Yeah. So, but no, well, thank you again. So glad to have you on with us and share some of your experience. So, as we think about wheat management plans, obviously, if our farmers across Illinois and Indiana and the Eastern Corn Belt have planted their wheat, there's really nothing we can do about where we're at so far, but want to just visit, for high yield wheat. What are some practices if we had to start this crop over to set us up for a high yield crop of wheat? What would be some good practices that we want to start with establishment and whatnot?
So if we think back to the fall of 25, one of the things we kind of got some issues with was how dry it was coming out of September into October. And, there was a couple little rains in there, guys caught some moisture. So really depending on whether you worked the ground, tilled it, what stage you were in, really depending on whether you got that weed up or not. Some guys, again, were stayed at their inch planting depth and just planted it in the dust so the bends will bust, right? And and that wheat really didn't come up or emerge until we did actually get a bigger rain toward the end of October. Some other guys that, when you were planting there, say the first week October and maybe no tilling in the soybean stubble, if you push that depth down to maybe 2.5 inches, you could actually get enough moisture to get it up. So we saw some guys do that, and that wheat got up and got going pretty good. So now the remnants of that coming into the spring, looking at some stands here a couple of weeks ago, is you really see those guys that pushed it down and got it up. What you see is nice even stands that tillered well in the fall. What you're seeing in other spots where we maybe waited on that rain is what you see is maybe half of the field got up and then the other half didn't come up until it actually did rain. So you're seeing some splotchiness out there in growth, depending on planting depth and how the wheat, got out of the ground. Now, What that will affect, obviously, is your growth moving forward here in the spring. So, wheat's no different than the other crop. You always want it up and even and growing evenly across the field. So those uneven fields, can it still grow good wheat? Sure. Will it be the highest yielding wheat you ever raised? Probably not. Because you just don't have that evenness. The other thing that you will see from that is those more uneven emerged fields that are now in the spring, you will see a much wider, what I call head height window. So as you get to the spring, you get to heading, you won't get that perfect tabletop, when you look across the top of that wheat field and everything's just right there. All your heads are right there. You get about a 6-inch window. It's easy to cut. When you get all this delay in tillering and difference in tillering, you're going to see a much larger head height window, probably 12 to 16, 18 inches. You're going to have little heads down in the canopy. On some late tillers where the wheat tried to tiller late, tried to push those up. They ran out of gas, they ran out of time, and they stay low in the canopy. They stay green to where your bigger tillers, plants that emerge first in the fall, actually go ahead and come up and make your big heads and come up to the top. So it'd be a little more of an erratic head canopy in the spring on those two, and ultimately that does affect yield, and it'll affect head count and head size.
Scott, is there anything we can do when we come into spring from a micronutrient or some kind of growth regulator or something that can help us fix that on high management? Or is that pretty well set just because of the difference in tillering between that fall emergence and the tillering that we'd see in the spring?
Yeah, it really is hard to influence that. That's kind of plant physiology. You either get it or you don't. The one thing you can do is, target those fields with some maybe a little bit earlier nitrogen, a little bit tendency on the higher rates, split those apps. You can sometimes induce some tillering and kick those plants in the butt and get them going earlier. And that all depends on the spring. It depends on what Mother Nature gives us in March and how that wheat's going to respond to that. That's probably one of the few options you have to try and mitigate any of those differences in fall emergence. Outside of that, it's just kind of, you hope Mother Nature gives you a nice, moderate, gradual warm up in the spring, and those plants will catch up if they get that. But you start throwing adversity at them, and they get further behind.
Scott, one question I've got for you. We're on some coarser textured soils up my way where we historically raised wheat as, a way to build organic matter. And also, it's not something that we're looking to crank 300 bushels off of a corn crop. So maybe we can get a 80 bushel wheat crop off of it if we catch the right rains. If a guy's taking a look at a sparse stand, at what point would you say it's probably time to walk away from it and switch back over to a new crop in the spring?
So really what I look at is, I'll do my stand counts per square foot. And looking at those, what I want to see, a really good stand of wheat where we're going to say we got, potential for our highest yields. You're in the mid 20s to upper 20s, maybe even pushing 30 plants per square foot. When you start getting under 20, you can still probably manage that crop up a little bit. But when you sink into the low teens and really get under 15 plants per square foot, you're getting in an area where it's just going to be really tough to manage that crop to a level that probably makes sense to keep it. Now, if you got to have straw, something like that,
Sure.
There's other factors there. But if you're looking at just pure yield, once you get in the low teens, 13, 14, or, even if you get into single digits, you're probably looking at 50 to 60% relative yield for the year. So if you've got a good wheat year and wheat's making 100, you're probably in a scenario where that wheat's going to make 50, 60 bushel an acre. So, and then it's up to the grower. He's got to decide on the economics of that and what it means. But definitely when you get into low teens and single digits, those are fields you really got to watch and are pretty suspect.
Maybe planning ahead, Scott, for, the fall of 26. When you talk about high management wheat, there's a lot of folks in their mind that kind of think about that kind of UK model where you've got lower populations, intensive management. That's not really, I guess, the North American model per se. To get to your ideal number of somewhere in the mid 20s, let's say, per square foot, what kind of population for high yielding wheat should we be shooting for when we're actually seeding the wheat in the fall?
Most time we're going to start out, if we're in early October, good conditions, warm soils, moist soils, we're going to be in that 1.5 to 1.6 million range. If we start throwing adversity at it, we'll take that up. But really, that 1.6 to 1.7, I'd say, is where a lot of our higher management wheat gets seeded. There's some circumstances we'll push to 2 million. Very seldom do we go over 2 million. But in most cases, we're over 1.5 million as well. So between 1.5 and 2 is kind of a good place to be. What I'll always say is for every adverse condition you throw at it in the fall, you add 10%. So if you're going to start at 1.5 and now it's late, it's cold, it's wet, those you could call that 3 adverse conditions. You're probably going to crank that up to near 2 million. So just that's kind of the rule of thumb we use. But yeah, starting out good conditions, that 1.6 to 1.7 is kind of our sweet spot.
Transitioning from, high management wheat as it relates to your seeding rate, Scott, tell me about what you'd recommend for a nitrogen plan. There's a lot of folks that are entertaining getting back into wheat if it's the first time in a decade. Maybe they haven't shepherded this crop through in a number of years. What does that nitrogen management plan look like? Oftentimes we talk about a split application, but how do you recommend kind of front loading or back loading as folks are looking at ratios, things of that nature?
So, I'll talk about nitrogen in 2 seasons, so to speak. So, I always talk about fall nitrogen. So if we're going behind corn, we got to have a little available in there to get that going in the fall. But really, so when the calendar flips to January 1, I start over at 0, right? I either used what I put out there or I lost it over the winter or something. So I'm kind of starting at 0 on January 1. And then we're going to manage to that relationship to where yield goes up as nitrogen rate goes up right till the wheat falls over, right? So that's
Yep.
the apex on the curve we're trying to hit. And to be honest with you, that number, that's not a same number for every grower. That number does change, and that's why it's kind of tough. I've got growers that are probably sitting at 120, 125 pounds of spring in. And we've got some growers probably pushing 160 to 170 pounds of spring in. But it really takes some experience. If you're going to push those higher end rates, you really need some on-farm local experience with that. I've worked with growers before that have said, yeah, my standard plan's been 100 pounds in. Well, we're not going to take that guy from 100 to 160 in 1 year, because that's a disaster waiting to happen. You definitely got to play with that and creep up slowly. Do some of your own on-farm trials to figure out, where that maximum rate is, because it is a little different. And timing affects that, soil types affect that, weather affects that. I've said for a long time, spring nitrogen management of wheat has come an art just as much as it is in a science. You gotta rely on your experience and what you're being dealt. But with all that said, the split applications do allow us some flexibility in those rates. We know we can push the rate a little higher when we do split apps versus a single shot. And we know we can influence things like we mentioned earlier about tillering early. If we need to try and induce some tillering early, we can go with a February shot and get that going. If we got all the tillers we need, we'll back that off. And maybe we'll only go 40% of our nitrogen up early and then come back with a heavier shot a little bit later. And then, of course, the nitrogen, not only the rate, but the timing. And the timing is as critical as well, watching when joining happens and when we know that critical uptake period is going to occur and making sure we got nitrogen there. And at the same time, having enough nitrogen late to make sure we're getting good grain fill and good grain content as well. So yeah, it's a balancing act, but and sometimes you got to deal with what Mother Nature allows you to do. In our part of the world, with our heavy clay soils, we just can't apply nitrogen every day we want to. It's either got to get dry or frozen or dry enough, so to speak. So a lot of variables there, but definitely a strategy to work with and takes a little experience. So.
Scott, on the corn side, we've got a lot of folks in those high yield environments that are doing things, in their corn nitrogen application with maybe sulfur or looking at some other micros. Over the years, I've had some growers that have used some sulfur with their nitrogen. What are your thoughts on the, high yielding wheat with maybe sulfur or zinc, or is there a benefit to boron during the reproductive stages with wheat that we're starting to see in corn? What's your thoughts on using micronutrients as an addition to your top dress application on wheat?
So definitely sulfur, without a doubt. I mean, we're adding sulfur to almost every field. So whether that's, in the form of AMS, if we're going dry products, or ATS, if we're going liquid products, we're definitely trying to shoot for that 20 to 25 pounds of sulfur. You definitely got to get enough sulfur out there to, to get that crop going. I'll give you a good example. The latest world record on wheat was set at like 267 bushel the acre. They put on 75 pounds of sulfur to get there, and 312 pounds of nitrogen. So that gives you an idea of that as these yields, as we continue to push up, you're going to have to feed it, no different than what we see in corn. So we need a minimum of about 20 pounds of sulfur. And then if you're going to keep pushing and pushing harder, you're probably going to have to creep that up as you creep up your nitrogen to keep that ratio as well. Because we do know if you start to see sulfur deficiency, you will have an effect on your nitrogen efficiency uptake as well. So as we know, nitrogen and sulfur being tied together and how they come into the plant, it's definitely important to keep those two in a good relationship to each other. As far as the other micros, zinc, boron, copper, what I'll say to those is probably haven't seen the responses as much in our clays. What I do know, if you're moving to some sandy soils that just inherently don't hold nutrients as well at all, you can probably start to see some responses from some of these other macros like boron, copper, even zinc to a certain point. So I would say, if you're in some clay soils and not seeing a lot, that's probably pretty true. But if you start moving to some sandy stuff, that's probably where you'll get your biggest bang for your buck or see the responses first.
Scott, I'm curious. I'd like to delve a little bit into the, alternative management world, if you will, thinking about plant growth regulators and how we might be able to use some of those that are on the market today. We talk about that apex, right, of nitrogen management and how much you can pump into the plant before it lays over. I know that there's folks with experience with products like Palisade in years gone by, trying to help reduce overall, wheat height, to help mitigate that lodging risk. There's a whole portfolio now of products, within the Nexta brand that folks are dabbling in. As it relates to wheat management, is there any active or is there any inhibition of a specific plant growth hormone or an additional expression of it that you think would be advantageous to wheat growers to start dabbling with as they look to kind of raise those wheat yield levels to the next?
Yeah, so definitely as you look at, just the next to lineup of products and how they're affecting these plant hormones, there's some things there. To be honest, I don't think we fully understand,
Sure.
how they're working in wheat. But you mentioned Palisade, and that's a great example. Because you look what Palisade does, the active ingredient Palisade, and what it actually physiologically does in a plant is it inhibits the production of gibberellic acid. So if we go back to the 5 or 6 major plant hormones, gibberellic acid is one of those. So what that gibberellic acid is doing is elongating those cells and making them grow taller. So when you take a product like Palisade and you inhibit gibberellic acid production at a specific growth stage in a plant, you shorten up those cells. You make them go fatter and wider instead of longer and taller. Hence, what you get with a product like Palisade is a shortening effect and better standability under higher nitrogen rates. So, while Palisade, we call it a quote chemical, it's having the same type of effect as what maybe some of these biologicals are having, maybe in the reverse, right? Typically, our biologicals will enhance some of these plant hormones, produce more of them, but Palisade's kind of doing the opposite of that. And Palisade works very well, works extremely well. And we use a lot of it in our part of the world, especially on our manure acres, where you just don't know how much nitrogen you're getting and when you're getting it. So it definitely helps us to manage that nitrogen risk as well. So now what I will say is a product like Palisade is very specific on timing. And I think that's what we'll find out as we move forward with our biologicals and some of these other plant hormone type products is that there's going to be specific timings where they work and they work very well. There's going to be other timings that you're outside of that timing, you're probably going to see no response at all. And that's just because of the plant hormones and what they're doing in the plant at that time and what the plant needs or doesn't need. To figure out those timings can be pretty tough. And I think that's what we're going to have to work through on these products. But I think there's definitely opportunity there. And I think once we get it figured out, there'll be some products that to give us another little boost.
Well, I think you nailed it in terms of just getting an appreciation for how these hormones operate within the plant. You referred to gibberellic acid and how, if we inhibit it, then that means that we can kind of shrink up the cell elongation, which is great in a situation where you're really pushing intensive management. You don't want the crop to lay over on you. Take the sands, though, that I might work with. If they're under stressful conditions and we were to apply that, Palisade type of product, maybe that wouldn't be such a good thing if we're undergoing some stressful growing conditions, and that gibberellic acid would be beneficial in the face of, some of that environmental stress. And so it just kind of comes down to knowing, your ground, how you're managing it, what your goal is, and then you can kind of use those different levers. You might pull up in one situation or pull back in another. Like you said, there's just a whole lot for us to unpack and learn in this space. And I'd strongly encourage listeners, if they're interested in exploring some of these realms with us, please reach out to your local Pioneer sales rep or your local field agronomist. We'd love to be along for part of that journey to design a good trial to make sure we get a strong indicator of how to best leverage some of these types of technology.
Yeah, and I'll add to that and just say that, I think it's an opportunity too. Just don't buy something because somebody tells you to apply it, right? Understand what the product is, what the product's doing, what it's supposed to do physiologically. And if you understand all that, you begin to get a better understanding of what kind of response you can expect, right? Rather than just spraying 5 ounces of this stuff at this growth stage and boy, I didn't see anything. I'll never do that again, right? So you gotta just be a scholar, do a little study and do a little research and understand what the product's supposed to do, what it's affecting, and when the plant you can have that effect on it. So the internet today is an amazing thing. There's a ton of information out there. So, and good information. You look in the right spots.
Thinking about other applications here later this spring, and you mentioned it, about don't just apply something just because somebody's selling it or whatnot. Thinking about another application of fungicide. I'll be honest, I probably follow fungicide response in corn and soybeans a little bit closer than I do necessarily wheat. And so, what's your status on fungicide in wheat and kind of the gauge of the market a little bit?
So really our fungicide strategies really fits into 3 areas. So we're going to, in our part of the world, we'll do an early fungicide, typically with our spring herbicide. So the wheat's pretty small, you're just at the early green up stage. And really what we're trying to do there is, for us, is keep stripe rust out. Stripe rust comes in early. It's one of the earlier pathogen comes in. We can come out there with a lot of fungicides with a base rate of a fungicide and really keep stripe rust out. So that's kind of our first strategy. Do that pretty economical. The second strategy then comes around flag leaf. We all know that the flag leaf is responsible for a very high percentage of that plant's growth, its potential yield. So we got to keep the flag leaf clean. So whether that's powdery mildew, the Septoria species, just a lot of things going on there. It's important to keep the flag leaf clean. Now, with that said, which kind of takes you to the third strategy is your head scab products. So this is the Fusarium head blight that we're trying to keep out. And where we've kind of made a little transition in the last few years is if you look at the timing of that flag leaf application and the timing of that head scab application, they're not that far apart. You're maybe in a lot of cases 7 to 10 days, maybe 14 days. So in a lot of cases, guys are maybe omitting that flag leaf application if the flag leaf's clean, if we don't have a lot of disease out there, and then making that head scab application, because those head scab products are also very effective on those same pathogens that we would have been trying to clean up on the flag leaf. So whether it's your Septorias or your powdery mildews, things like that, those SDHI triazole type products are actually very highly effective on those pathogens as well. So if we don't have a tremendous amount of disease present, a lot of guys will maybe skip that flag leaf application and then really concentrate on the head scab, and not only pick up the head scab, but then pick up the foliar protection on flag leaf as well.
The inverse on that, though, is not entirely the same, right, Scott? I mean, a lot of the traditional fungicides that we had used at the flag leaf application, at least until the last handful of years, didn't have head scab protection in them, correct?
Oh, you're 100% right. So yeah,
Okay.
So when we were looking at products, particularly your strobies, strobilurin fungicides is where we use a lot on the flag leaf. Virtually no activity on head scab whatsoever. So yeah, you're right. So when you did make that application, you didn't help yourself on head scab at all, you were still going to have to make that head scab application. So that's just a place where, when wheat economics have gotten tough, guys have found a place to maybe save a few dollars and not really give up a lot of yield doing it. So now there's going to be a year, 2 out of 10, that you're going to need that foliar application on the flag leaf, regardless of whether you're going to make your head scab application, because there's going to be some disease come in and you're going to have to clean it up. So yep, it's again a year by year deal, and the easiest way to know is just go walk in the field, be in the field.
To that point, Scott, give us maybe 2 or 3 scouting tips for those guys that are maybe in the transition from just being kind of your run-of-the-mill traditional wheat growers to trying to make that transition to a high yield, I don't want to say profitable, but I guess that's really the right word,
Right.
for wheat. The guys that needed it for straw or manure ground or things like that, to the guys that are really turning it into a big cash crop for them, even with some tough economics. What are 2 or 3 things that those guys are doing that you need to be thinking about, whether it's scouting or other things, to make that transition to a high yielding wheat field beyond what maybe we.
Yeah, so I think it's, as you look at where we're at today in the spring, what you can do, what you can affect, what am I going to make sure I do? It's really 3 things. If there's 3 times I got to be in a wheat field, it's going to be 3 times in the spring. And one of them is going to be here shortly when the snow melts off, or, as we approach end of February and you get closer to green up, you've got to be out there assessing stands. What are my stands? What are my tiller counts? What are my potential heads per square foot? And really making that assessment on where you're at. Once you've done that, and that kind of starts to formulate your nitrogen program, then you're really probably the next time I'm out there in a big way is right after joining or right around joining, which is that Feeks grew stage 6 when the growing point moves above the ground. And what I'm really wanting to make sure I understand then is that I'm not shorting that plant on nitrogen. And this is what goes back to the idea of, when can I get across the field? So yeah, maybe it's a week earlier than I really want to go on my nitrogen, but if it's dry or if it's frozen and I can get across it, but they're calling for a warm up, a warm, wet warm up after that, I probably need to get it on. Because what I never want to see is a wheat crop starving for nitrogen after Feeks grow stage 6. If you see yellow wheat after joining, the yield is going down. You've cost yourself yield, and there's no way to make it up. You can turn it green again, but what yield is gone is gone. So you got to make sure that as you're approaching 6, that you've got a good plan on nitrogen, and you're supplying it to that plant when it wants it and when it's got to have it. And then of course probably the last one is making sure that head scab application timing is correct. Getting to that 10.5.1 flowering growth stage and making sure you're making your applications as close to that as you possibly can. Now, some of the newer products on the market offer some wider application windows, but as you read those labels, they'll also tell you that optimum timing is still early flower or 10.5.1. So again, you're playing the weather. If you can't hit the ideal time, and you can go a few days earlier, maybe you do get it on. So it's just that, but you just got to be in the field watching and understanding exactly where the plant's at for the timing aspect. So always say in real estate, the 3 magic words are location, location, location. When it comes to wheat, it's timing, timing, and timing, and just understanding the growth stages and making sure you're hitting those pretty close.
Scott, I have a question. And those are all really fantastic recommendations here for our listeners, especially aspiring for an even more profitable wheat crop. But as I think about our winter season, and as we've been discussing a little bit before we started recording today, you were just sharing how you had a foot of snow in Southern Illinois. And as I look out my window in Northern Illinois, I have a very trace amount. We experienced some very severe freezing temperatures here in January, and then as I think about probably across the Midwest, our snow cover has been really variable, and our temperatures have been really variable too. I think Christmas was 50 degrees maybe, and but we also had some pretty severe cold temperatures too. I guess in your perspective and experiences, how do those temperature fluctuations as well as snow cover fluctuations, how do those really impact our overall final result of our wheat crop?
So as you look at those on the final result, as long as we don't get too drastic and we don't get a January or February warm up that lasts 3 weeks and we get a growth stage advancement and then we get cold again after that. But these periods of 3, 4, 5 days, yeah, the wheat may turn a gross or a color darker green and act like it's growing and then gets cold again. Those really aren't having much effect. As long as we're not advancing growth stages at that point, you're fine. And obviously the snow cover is a good thing. Covered up, especially with the temperatures we had. The snow cover has been a great thing for us. But at the same time, even without snow cover, this we're growing winter wheat. This wheat knows how to handle cold temperatures. It's not the deal to where it gets to zero and it's going to die. It's winter wheat. It'll be fine. Its goal is to survive and make it to the next generation, and it's a pretty darn hardy crop. So yeah, I'm not worried about these 3 and 4 day temperature fluctuations here and there. You put a 3 week warm up in February and it gets to 75 and the wheat takes off. Yeah, we'll have another discussion. But these deals we've had this winter, we're okay. Nothing alarming yet.
Scott, I've got one question for you on harvest. Today, it appears to me the guys that I've got that are really high yield wheat growers appear to be harvesting earlier at a wetter grain moisture than what was traditionally thought of in wheat production. Can you shed some light on that, or some thoughts, I guess, from your perspective with the folks you work with? What is their harvest moisture? What are they shooting for? And is that contributing to additional yield because you're not losing stuff in the field on the header and things like that?
Yeah, so that the idea of harvesting wetter is all about quality preservation. There's no doubt. So we get to that time of year, we get into the month of June. We can have rainy weeks. We can have bright sunshine for 14 days, and we can have rain for 14 days. When we get into June. So who really knows? So that idea of harvesting wet is just the idea that I'm preserving the quality that I've already got. So we all know what happens if a wheat field gets to 12 or 13% and then starts to get wet and dry and wet and dry, what that does to test weight, what it does to falling numbers, what it does to starch quality and everything that goes with that. So I think that's, especially guys with larger acres are definitely after that. They'll really low 20s and, is what I see guys that start at. And really, you get under 20, you can handle it. At 22%, 23% wheat, your truck drivers are not going to be very happy, right? Wheat just doesn't run out of a truck very well at 23%. But at 18, it actually runs out pretty good. 18, 19, you can actually get out of a truck. But yeah, so guys starting earlier, number two things. I mean, preserve quality, and number two, just the sheer amount of acres they may need to get over. And we all know that every day counts on the double crop beans. So that's another reason they're pushing that as early as they possibly can, just to get squeeze every bushel of yield out of them we can. So. And if you get out there on a Monday and you get a couple hundred acres cut and the beans planted and it rains on Wednesday or Thursday and you're 4 days after that before you get back, I mean, you just gained yourself a week or 10 days just by cutting at 18 or 20 instead of waiting on 13.
Thank you, Scott. To kind of wrap up here and close out our discussion today, I thought I would look to the future, especially eager to hear your input and perspective as somebody that has, like you said at the beginning of our call, you cut your teeth on wheat and have spent your career in a very wheat critical area. Looking ahead, what is your thoughts, or how do you think hybridization of wheat will change kind of the world of wheat production?
Yeah, I always said I couldn't retire until I get to sell hybrid wheat. So it looks like they're going to force my hand, and I might have to retire someday. But yeah, this is pretty exciting stuff. I mean, and I thought about this the other day. It's kind of ironic that Pioneer's celebrating 100 years this year, and it's basically 100 years after we brought hybrid corn to the market. We're going to bring hybrid wheat to the market. It'd actually be 101 years, I guess, but pretty close. We'll call it 100. But when you look at what the hybrid vigor you get out of the hybridization process and what we're going to be able to do with disease tolerances and standability and just everything that process brings is just tremendous. I'm extremely excited. I've been fortunate enough now for the last 3 years, I guess, to watch our hybrid program and be in those plots in the spring and look at those products and just it really is pretty neat technology, and we're at the forefront of it, right? I mean, think of what hybrid corn was when they first started. That's where we're at with wheat today. So if you think about what's it like 20 years from now after we get hybridization going, who knows? I mean, and the other side of that is people say, why do we need more wheat? Wheat's $4.50 a bushel, $5. We don't need more, right? But at the same time, it's all about bushels. And I really believe, at least in my little part of the world, it'd be our first chance to probably get to 150 bushel field averages. I know in some parts of even Illinois or other places, we've seen some wheat yields close to that, but really not very consistently doing that. I think as the hybridization gets here, we'll see products that give us the ability to probably do that on a pretty consistent basis. Once we figure out a few management techniques around them, when we get into the breeding cycles a little deeper, you're going to see some pretty outstanding yields coming out of this stuff, and hopefully the quality to go with it. So, as it stands right now, it looks like the fall of 29 is when we will probably release our first commercial hybrids in the soft red winter market. It looks like probably the fall of 27 in the hard red winter market out west, so the Central Plains. So definitely some exciting stuff coming. And obviously, once we even make the commercial release, it'll take a year or two to get the whole lineup going. So you're probably talking early 2030s before we make a complete flip to hybrid wheat, but definitely not going to happen in 1 year. But it's going to be pretty neat to get this stuff to the market. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. So not many times in your career do you get to initialize something that happens, once in a lifetime, or once in a crop, so to speak. So think back to the guys in 1930 that got to commercialize hybrid corn. I mean, so yeah, we're in a position that's going to be pretty unique. It's going to be pretty exciting, pretty fun.
No, thank you so much. I figured as we were planning this episode and who would be a great speaker on this, I figured, I bet Scott probably has gotten his hands or has touched or been boots in the field with some hybrid wheat before possibly. So we really appreciate your wealth of knowledge you've shared here with us and our listeners today, and wishing everybody a prosperous and productive wheat growing season here, or wheat crop here in 2026. Thank you.
This has been another episode of Outstanding in Your Field. Like and follow our podcast wherever you are listening. We've got a new episode at least once a month. You can also find us on YouTube by following Pioneer Seeds. You can find me on Instagram at B_K_Schrader.
I'm Crystal Williams. You can contact me at crystal.williams@pioneer.com.
And I'm Carl Jorn. You can follow along with me at CJorn on X, or on Facebook at CJorn Agronomy. That's CJOERN.
That concludes this Pioneer Agronomy video podcast. Visit our page on pioneer.com and follow us on Twitter and Facebook for more agronomy insights.